So when I die, the land that I love so much here is going to be held in trust, and uh, with a land conservancy. And we are all discussing the terms of this protection. And I saw a boilerplate uh, conservation easement, and the boilerplate conservation easement said something about how there would be no commercial logging allowed except in circumstances that would improve forest health. And that is all going to be struck because there will be no tree cutting allowed, commercial or non-commercial in any case. But the interesting thing for me is just the ubiquity at this point of the commercial logging for forest health argument and its utter stupidity. Back in 1994 or 5 or 6 or 3 or somewhere in there, I was asked by a alternative newspaper in Spokane to write an article about logging for forest health. And I remember the editor said to me, you know, it seems like a real no-brainer. Of course, there are times when you need to cut the forest down to improve the health. And I couldn't really wrap my mind around the whole issue until one day, and I still remember, this is one of those memories where, you know, I remember the slant of the sun as I was driving up Division in Spokane, North Division, on my way to dumpster dive for my chickens when I got it. And what I got was, I had interviewed Robert J. Lifton a couple years before, and he's a world's foremost authority on the psychology of genocide. And one of the things that I have referenced of his many times is something called claims to virtue, which is before you can commit any atrocity, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is good. And you have to convince other people that what you're doing is good. So the example he uses is that the Nazis weren't committing genocide and mass murder, but they were instead purifying the Aryan race. They were doing what they perceived as a good thing. And this is true on every level. You know, I've joked many, many times that I have never once in my life been a jerk. Because every time I have been a jerk, I have had it fully rationalized that my behavior, they deserve whatever behavior I'm doing, that this is a right and respectable and honorable thing to do. Of course, objectively, I was being a jerk. And you see this all over the place. And one of the places you see this all the time is in the timber industry. That, well, I mean, we see on a larger scale too. Capitalists are not murdering the planet. They are developing natural resources. Bright greens are not killing the planet. They are saving us from global warming. You know, it's just, you see it everywhere. And in fact, I would argue that the primary use of human sentience, such as it is to come up with claims to virtue for whatever we wanted to do in the first place. But as it has to do with deforestation, there's been a whole series of these that you have to cut. The forests are sick because they've been logged, and that's weakened them, and therefore you have to cut them down because they're sick. There are beetles in the trees. And because there are beetles in the trees, you have to cut them down to prevent the beetles from spreading, which I will point out was the exact same argument that was used in the death camps. When someone would get typhus, they would kill them immediately to prevent the typhus from spreading. Exact same logic. And in fact, they use the same language. They will say they're going to treat that area. It's a treatment. In fact, it's a final treatment. Anyway, the forests are, because the forests in the West routinely burn, and because there hasn't been enough fire lately, that means that we need to cut them all down. Never mind the fact that the trees, if you're going to cut any trees for fire prevention, you want to cut the tiny trees, not the merchantable timber. The big old trees aren't the ones to cut. So it's ubiquitous. I have a friend in Colorado who has some land, who is one of the only people in the area who did not deforest for forest health purposes. And George Werthner and others make the argument that cutting, and this makes perfect sense to me, and I'll explain it, that cutting down the trees to prevent them from getting a disease is the worst thing you can do. First off, you're presuming that they may die, so you're killing them anyway. But if they get the disease, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to die. But more importantly, there might be 1,000 trees on a piece of land or 5,000 trees. Who knows which of those trees is, in fact, carries a resistance to that disease? Which of those trees carries a defense mechanism against those beetles? And if you're cutting them all down, you're not giving it a chance to have natural selection. And this is ignoring, of course, the importance of dead trees for habitat. Dead trees are more important for habitat than live trees are, for habitat for other creatures. That's a part of the forest. You have a mosaic of live and dead trees. You know, we've all heard of how chestnut blight wiped out the American chestnut. That's not true. What happened is chestnut blight came through and killed lots of chestnut trees, but you know what killed them? The foresters who came through afterwards and killed the still standing chestnut trees who had developed an immunity to it. It was cutting down the chestnut trees, the last remaining chestnut trees, the immune chestnut trees, is what wiped them out. So, long story short, when I do make the easement, it will include that there will be no, well, there's another part of the problem here, which is that not only is it bad ecologically, but we all know that if you allow someone to have a legal loophole through which they can destroy some wild nature, they'll do it. And it's not that I don't trust the people to whom I am going to grant the conservation easement. I trust them absolutely. They seem really great. But they will die. And the organization will shift. And at some point, there will be someone who wants to cut the trees. And they will find any excuse, whether it's forest health, whether it doesn't matter. Using forest health as an excuse to deforest is a scam. Forests know better than people with chainsaws how to make a healthy forest, and trust nature.